Visualforce is Salesforce's pretty much oldest custom user interface technology. It consists of HTML-like markup. So you write in an HTML-like language that can actually include HTML, what you want your page to look like, what fields you want to have on your page, for example, what actions you want your page to take. In addition to writing that, you also typically use what's called a controller, which is very often it's custom Apex code that sits in between your HTML and the database, and it controls the flow of information between your markup and the database. And then because you're writing Apex code, of course, you're writing unit tests. So if you're writing a Visualforce page, you're typically writing at least those three things: the HTML markup, very often an Apex controller that controls access to the database, and then unit tests for that code. Visualforce has been around for 10 years, 12 years, something like that. There's a lot of Visualforce that's been developed over the years. It by itself does not really look like Lightning, but it's very easy to transform most Visualforce pages to look like Lightning. There's just a couple of keywords you can add up to the top of a Visualforce page, and when it's being displayed in Lightning, it will be rendered in a Lightning style using the Lightning design system. One of the issues with Visualforce is that there's a lot of transfer between the HTML that is rendering in your browser and the Apex controller that's running on the server. And every time the browser has to talk to the server, that adds time. It takes time for that processing to happen. So work is done in two different places within the browser and in the database. There's a lot of time spent transferring information back and forth. It can be slow. Visualforce is still useful in a number of ways. It's used, there's such a thing as a Visualforce email template that can look very nice. There's generating PDFs is typically still done using Visualforce rather than other technologies. But other than that, sad to say, because it was my friend for a long time, Visualforce lived a long and useful life, but it's really in its waning days. Much more modern technologies, fortunately, have come along since then. Starting several years ago, when Salesforce announced Lightning, they announced something that at the time was called Lightning Components and now is called Aura Components. And I'm keeping an eye on the clock and will avoid going through all of the details I went through on Visualforce, but there are a number of different components when you're writing an Aura component, a number of pieces to it. Many of those pieces are either CSS or JavaScript, and there's a lot more logic that happens on the browser side of things, which means less need for frequent transfers back and forth to the database, less need for Apex code, although there often still is a need for that. The advantage of Aura components, or really any kind of Lightning component, is that rather than creating a monolithic page, you can divide your page into logical pieces, implement each piece as a separate component, and then have them interact with each other. Aura components, like the other kind of component, Lightning Web Components, they look like Lightning. You don't have to do as much work as you might to make them look in Visualforce to make them look like Lightning. They're built on a framework that's called Aura, as the name might imply, which is at its time was a really great and groundbreaking kind of framework for doing user interface development. One of the hallmarks of Aura components and really any kind of Lightning component is that so much more work is done than used to be on the client side, which makes the round trips to the server quicker, which, despite what some people perceive as performance in Lightning, actually makes the user interface quicker and more responsive. And then finally, the last kind I'll talk about is Lightning Web Components, which are sort of the next generation beyond Aura components. They have a lot of similarities. You can create separate and reusable components that interact with each other rather than creating big monolithic Visualforce pages like we used to. It also looks like Lightning and can also be used in Classic. But it's the framework that Lightning Web Components are based on is significantly smaller than the Aura framework. It's built directly on the web stack, which makes it faster, it makes it more secure, and it generally tends to be easier to build Lightning Web Components than Aura components, and makes it's quicker to build them as well. So there are definitely different technologies that can be used. If I were starting from scratch and trying to figure out which technology to start to learn, I would go with Lightning Web Components. Visualforce, sadly, is being dead-ended, and while it might be a little bit easier to learn, it's not where the future of user interfaces are in Salesforce, with a few exceptions like email templates and the ability to generate PDF. Lightning Web Components are really where Salesforce is putting the bulk of their energy now. As I say, it's really, it's easier to learn even than Aura components were. It's quicker to build, and of course, there's lots of Trailhead modules out there that can be helpful with that. Jason, anything else you'd like to add to all of that?
I know as far as my preference, I'm using Lightning Web Components as much as possible anymore.